I would like to welcome you all to the first ATS SRN webinar of the year. So welcome back from the summer. I hope everyone had a wonderful summer. And my name is Helena Schotland. I'm here at the ICANN School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York, and my co-moderator is Iris Perez, who is on the other coast at USC Children's in Los Angeles. And representing the middle of the country, we have Cathy Goldstein. And Cathy and I go back for years now. And as you may know, Cathy is a professor of neurology at the University of Michigan. She originally trained at the Medical College of Georgia for medical school, did her internship and residency in neurology at the University of Colorado, and was a clinical fellow of sleep medicine at Northwestern University. Cathy has been at the University of Michigan since 2012. While at Michigan, Cathy got an MS at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. And since 2022, she's been a clinical professor of neurology at U of M, and has served as a senior editor of one of the textbooks that I'm sure we all have, The Principles and Practice of Sleep Medicine, and holds editorial roles for Up to Date and the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine. So without further ado, I'm going to make the joke and say it is now time for circadian rhythms.
Yay! Awesome. Thank you guys all so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen. And while I am doing that, I will tell you, if you want to know how long that I have known Helena, she was at my child's first birthday, and that child just became a sixth grader this week. So it is wild. We're all around here for a long time. Okay, I just want to make sure that everyone can see my slides and they're on the full screen. Can I get a thumbs up? Awesome. Okay, great. And for all the learners,
we're seeing all your slides. It's not the.
Oh, it's not. Okay.
Yes.
Oh,
we're seeing all your slides. Yeah.
Sorry, this got changed. Let me try this again.
And one other thing I just wanted to mention to all our participants is please put your questions in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Slideshow. There you go.
Okay, I'm going to actually do it this way and see if this makes it easier. Beginning. Okay. Okay. How about now? Good. Perfect. There we go. Okay. All right. It is time for circadian rhythms. And I was telling everybody before, so for all of the attendees joining us, I talk a lot. I have a lot of slides. This is an important topic for practice, but also sometimes it's not something we see every day and we want to be prepared for board exams. So I want you guys to get a lot out of this. I do have a natural stopping point if I don't get through everything. And if I don't get through everything, I want to have some time for questions. And so I'll stop at that natural stopping point and I'll circulate some materials for you for self-study. Okay. So before we get into circadian regulation of sleep, we do need to understand that there is a two-process model that controls our sleep, the homeostatic sleep drive, or what we can think of as sleep hunger, and the circadian rhythm, the clock. And the homeostatic sleep drive, it's also known as process S. It builds and builds with wakefulness, and it's dissipated by sleeping. And we all read tons of sleep studies, and we see this every day reading sleep studies because the electrophysiological manifest of the homeostatic sleep drive is slow wave activity in non-REM sleep. And the homeostatic sleep drive is mediated by diffusible neurochemicals in the brain called somnogens. And the one that we know the most about is adenosine. And the reason I have the coffee cup up there is because of why caffeine is an adenosine receptor antagonist. And that's likely how it mediates its alerting effect. So adenosine increases with prolonged wakefulness because as you remain awake, your cells become fatigued and they decrease the ability to phosphorylate adenosine into ATP. So that adenosine then accumulates and it acts on the sleep generating centers of the brain. So it disinhibits our ventrolateral preoptic nucleus to generate sleep, but also at the same time, it inhibits our wake promoting neurons. And that system makes sure that we're not awake and asleep at the same time. If we just had the homeostatic sleep drive, we would build up our homeostatic sleep drive, dissipate it through a few hours of sleep, wake up and repeat. So we would have multiple sleep bouts throughout the 24-hour day, and that is not very advantageous. And that's why we have our circadian timing system. And circadian rhythms are any biological rhythm that repeats on the order of roughly 24 hours. And why do organisms have these? So they can anticipate and optimally respond to the light chart changes on Earth that are due to what? The Earth's rotation on its axis every 24 hours. And the real key to understanding circadian rhythms is to understand that these are self-sustained oscillations that are inherent to the organism. So they're not a reaction to time or light. They would oscillate in a sustained manner, even independent of those time cues. And how frequently does our circadian clock tick? We know that the average human circadian tau or circadian period is about 24.2, 24.15 hours. That means it takes 24.15 hours on average for one circadian cycle to repeat. How on earth do we know this? There's many old studies where they isolated individuals from time cues, sometimes by putting them in caves, and other times by other different modalities to separate sleep from circadian rhythms like forced desynchrony, and then you measure circadian controlled processes like cortisol, core body temperature, melatonin, and you look at how long it takes from peak to peak, nadir to nadir, and that is your circadian tau. And women have a shorter circadian tau by about 6 minutes. Okay, so how does this clock tick? The clock ticks based on a genetic transcription negative feedback model. And at the core of that model are BMAL and clock proteins, which are represented by these green and blue spheres here. And they bind to the promoters of the genes PER and CRY, which are then transcribed, form heterodimers in the nucleus, and then translocate back, or excuse me, heterodimers in the cytoplasm translocate back into the nucleus and then repress their own transcription. That repression on the transcription of PER and CRY is released after about 24.2 hours based on degradation of PER and CRY. And that is how we have that self-oscillating roughly 24.2 hour circadian rhythm. And the way that's maintained is by these post-translational modifications, so phosphorylation, as well as these ancillary loops that keep being discovered that fine-tunes that 24.2 oscillation. So where is the circadian clock ticking? So our central timekeeping system that regulates our sleep and wakefulness is in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus. It's a paired nuclei of about 10,000 neurons each. So how do you remember? It seems like everything about sleep goes back to the hypothalamus. You guys are busy saving lives in the ICU and treating pulmonary diseases on the side. How do you remember this? So the lateral hypothalamus, that's where the hypocretin cell bodies live. Those are relevant for narcolepsy. So lateral hypothalamus, narcolepsy, L to L. The anterior hypothalamus, A, is relevant for another A, D, and rhythms. So I don't usually like these mnemonics or tricks, but this is one that's just hard to remember, anterior versus lateral. So that's a good way to keep that in mind. Now, initially, it was just thought that the circadian timekeeping system was located in the brain. However, There is molecular machinery to generate circadian rhythms throughout nearly every tissue in the body. Up to 82% of protein coding genes show that rhythmic oscillation. So what that means is not only can you have misalignment between the external light-dark cycle and the central clock in the SCN of the anterior hypothalamus, but you can also have misalignment between the SCN and the peripheral clocks. You can have misalignment between different organs and within different organs, as well as misalignment with your behaviors and your SCNs, your behaviors and your peripheral clocks. What do I mean by behaviors? So eating a slice of pizza at 3 in the morning, that is misaligning your behavior with both your central and your peripheral clocks, because we have clocks in the gut. And so these multiple levels of potential circadian misalignment are likely why we see an increase in disease states with shift work. Okay, so we said this is a two-process model. How do the two processes interact? So I'll start by orienting you to this picture. So on the top, we have where it says sleep load. That's the homeostatic sleep drive. So the longer the arrow here, the greater your homeostatic sleep drive. On the bottom, we have our circadian alerting signal. So the circadian signal that is promoting wakefulness. We start at 9 a.m. here. We go to 9 a.m. the next day. So someone wakes up in the morning, they've slept all night, they haven't been woken up on call. Their homeostatic sleep drive is very low when they wake up in the morning. It builds and builds throughout the day. So how do you stay awake without falling asleep in the middle of the day? How do you make it to that bedtime 16 hours later? And that is because the circadian alerting signal increases in opposition to that growing homeostatic sleep drive. Now, around 2 hours prior to people's usual natural fall asleep time, the circadian alerting signal precipitously drops. And it drops at the same time that your melatonin secretion begins. And so you have that high homeostatic sleep drive, a drop in your circadian alerting signal, and this promotes sleep onset. But that homeostatic sleep drive is rapidly dissipated over the first 2 or so hours of sleep. So how do you stay asleep? Because the circadian alerting signal remains low, reaching its absolute lowest point of alertness about 2 to 3 hours prior to your natural wake-up time. This solid line here is the collective alertness due to the interaction of the homeostatic sleep drive and the circadian alerting signal. So just to draw your attention to a few points on this graph, you see this dip here. People call this the circadian dip in the afternoon. It's actually should be called the two-process model dip. It's when the homeostatic sleep drive has grown so much, but the circadian alerting signal has not yet increased enough to overcome it. So you get a little dip in alertness. Then around 8, 9 p.m., when all of our insomnia patients love to try and go to sleep, get an early start on this frustrating process, we have the forbidden zone for sleep, where you have a second wind. And this is actually when the circadian alerting signal is so high, it overshoots the homeostatic sleep drive. And you have one of your second peaks of alertness at this time. We can see this R here. So following that nadir of circadian alertness, that's our highest concentration of REM sleep. Okay, so this is a discussion on circadian rhythms, but what do we not measure in clinical practice? We don't objectively measure circadian phase, right? So how do we estimate what someone's circadian phase is so we know how to diagnose and treat them? We have to do this based on the expected relationship between habitual sleep and circadian phase. And when I say habitual sleep, this isn't when you want to sleep. This isn't I want to get up at 5 a.m. so I can work out before work. This is when your body naturally wants to sleep. So when you sleep on a prolonged vacation in this time zone, for kids, how they sleep on summer vacation. This is what I mean by habitual sleep time. So in this picture here, horizontally, we have time. This is a 24-hour clock. And then again, we have this habitual or natural sleep period. And this person sleeps well 11 p.m. to about 7 a.m. The dotted line is melatonin secretion. So what you can see is this stays low until about 2 hours prior to your natural fall asleep time. And that's when we have DILMO, or dim light melatonin onset. And the reason it's called dim light melatonin onset is because light suppresses melatonin. So this is something that is measured in the darkness, less than 5 to 10 lux. But that is timed roughly 2 hours prior to natural fall asleep time. And then it's going to peak. Your melatonin secretion is going to peak about 2 to 3 hours before your natural rise time, about 3 hours or so, and then it's going to rapidly decline to very low levels during the daytime. The dashed line here is your core, the solid line is your core body temperature minimum. So what we can see is the core body temperature minimum reaches its absolute nadir about 2 to 3 hours prior to your natural wake-up time. And that nadir of core body temperature minimum, that aligns exactly with that nadir of circadian alerting signal. So this is when you are at your sleepiness. And we see the core body temperature actually bumps up and increases during that forbidden zone for sleep, during that high circadian alerting signal. And then the dashed line here is your collective sleep propensity. And again, just kind of going back to this two-process model, the way these interact and are reflected by that objective circadian phase, in normal settings, this is going to promote 16 hours of consolidated wakefulness and 8 hours of sleep. Okay, so we know that the circadian clock ticks by genetic transcription translational negative feedback loop, but it is set by what we call Zeitgebers and time givers. And the reason that we have this is because we don't live on a 24.2-hour day. And that's what our endogenous clock, that's how fast it repeats. But we live on a 24-hour day. So to reset that 24.2-hour endogenous clock every day to the 24-hour day, there has to be a Zeitgeber or time giver. And the strongest one is light. And light information is received by the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells in our retina, and then light information goes down the retinohypothalamic tract, either directly through the SCN or indirectly through the intergeniculate leaflet, and then synchronizes the clock, synchronizes the SCN via glutamate transmission, which results in downstream alteration of clock gene transcription to result in that resetting every day. And melanopsin is the protein contained in the IPRGCs. And melanopsin has a peak spectral sensitivity of around 480 nanometers. And that's why we're so sensitive to short wavelength spectrum blue light. Both duration and intensity can impact the magnitude of phase shift that's produced by light, but this is not a linear process, and there's a lot of intra and inter-individual variability when it comes to phase shifting responses to light. Now, the magnitude and direction with which light phase shifts the clock is based on the biological time of exposure. And this can be summarized in something called a phase response curve, or PRC. And this is the PRC to light. And so just to orient you to this picture, then this is that habitual sleep time. Again, not when you want to sleep, when your body actually does sleep. The negative numbers here are hours before your natural fall asleep time. The positive numbers are hours after your natural fall asleep time. On the vertical axis here, we have the direction and magnitude of phase shift. The negative numbers here, that denotes a phase delay, or the circadian rhythm is moved later in reference to the 24-hour day. The positive number denotes a phase advance, or light exposure at this time makes the endogenous biological clock earlier in reference to the 24-hour day. So what can we see here? Looking 4 hours prior to natural fall asleep time, and then about 5 to 6 hours into the natural sleep period, light exposure at these biological times is going to produce a phase delay, or make our endogenous clock later in reference to a 24-hour day, make it harder to fall asleep, harder to wake up. light within about the last 3 hours of sleep and the hours following. So in a normally entrained person, daytime, light exposure at that time is going to move our endogenous circadian clock earlier in reference to the 24-hour day. And the crossover point from light producing a phase delay to a phase advance is aligned with what? That 2 to 3 hours prior to natural wake up time, which is our core body temperature minimum and our circadian nadir of alertness. So we look and we see like during the delay range, the biggest phase delay is occurring kind of within this 2 hours prior to natural fall asleep time. Light exposure at that time is going to produce your greatest phase delay. And what does that coincide with? That's when we like to shine little portable suns into our face with our electronic devices at night. And that's why part of even just general sleep hygiene, independent from circadian health, we discuss, maybe put that away, stay away from bright light. Now, there's also a phase response curve to melatonin. So again, we have our habitual sleep period. Negative numbers are hours before the natural fall asleep time. Positive numbers are hours after the natural fall asleep time. And the y-axis has the amount of phase shift and the direction, whether a phase delay, so making the internal clock later in reference to the external 24-hour day, or phase positive numbers denote a phase advance, making the biological clock earlier in reference to the 24-hour external day. So we can see if you take melatonin about 8 hours prior to natural fall asleep time through 2 hours prior to natural fall asleep time, it's going to produce a circadian phase advance or move the biological clock earlier in reference to external time. And we see that phase advance peaks about 5 hours or so before your natural fall asleep time. Taking melatonin within 2 hours of your natural fall asleep time through the hours that follow the offset of the natural sleep period is going to produce a circadian phase delay or make your biological clock later in reference to external time. And we see the crossover point for melatonin producing a phase advance to a phase delay is about 2 hours prior to natural fall asleep time. So what does that align with? Estimated dim light melatonin onset. So that's why those objective circadian phase marker times are important. We see a kind of dead zone here where melatonin is not really moving the clock in any direction. And that is occurring about 3 hours prior to your natural wake up time. And this is when your body's own melatonin peaks. So melatonin doesn't really do anything when your body's not making anything. Okay, so moving into what we've been waiting for, the circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders. So what are these? So these in general are chronic recurrent patterns of sleep-wake rhythm disruption that are thought due to either a problem with the internal circadian timing system or its ability to align and realign to the 24-hour day regularly, or misalignment between a normal internal timing system and the required or desired sleep-wake set schedule superimposed on that due to either the environment you're in, the location you're in, or social work schedules. Here is the key, and this is what I'm always stressing with my fellows. The circadian disruption has to lead to insomnia, sleepiness, or both. So if you are sleeping 2 a.m. to 11 a.m. and you're happy as a clam and it works for you, you do not have a circadian rhythm disorder. You don't. If you are waking up at 4 a.m. for work and you sleep normally, that might be a circadian rhythm disorder, but there's nothing wrong with your clock. There's something wrong with your work schedule. Okay, so what are the circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders? So we have the intrinsic disorders that are thought to be due to a problem with the circadian timekeeping mechanism or its ability to entrain to the external day, delayed sleep-wake phase advanced, irregular sleep-wake rhythm disorder, and non-24-hour sleep-wake rhythm disorder. Then we have shift work disorder and jet lag disorder, which, as mentioned, are thought to be in the context of having a normal circadian timekeeping system, but there is an abnormal schedule superimposed on that. How do we measure circadian rhythms? You can measure them directly through melatonin secretion that can be measured in the blood, the saliva, or the urine. That's rarely done. The other thing we measure is core body temperature with a rectal thermometer. Again, Rarely done. So how we usually measure circadian rhythms is by a proxy measurement. So you're not measuring endogenous circadian phase, you're measuring sleep as kind of a peripheral output of your circadian rhythm. And we can do that either with sleep logs, which are required for diagnosis, or actigraphy, which is wrist-worn accelerometry, with the premise that we move more when we're awake than we're asleep, which allows an algorithm to go through and estimate sleep versus wake based on your actigram. And actigraphy should accompany sleep logs whenever possible, but it's often not done for a variety of reasons that we won't get into. Okay. So what is delayed sleep-wake phase disorder? So with each of the circadian rhythm disorders, I'll show you this picture here. So this is a clock, obviously. Gray is normal sleep-wake timing. You can see here that's noon to 8, which would give somebody an estimated core body temperature minimum in the normal state of 6 a.m. This is just for the normal individuals, and an estimated dim light melatonin onset, only for the normal individuals, of around 9 p.m. And then the black bars are what sleep looks like in somebody with the circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorder. So in delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, there's a delay in the phase of the sleep episode in relation to the desired or required time for sleep, which results in insomnia at the beginning of the night when trying to go to bed at the desired or required time, and difficulty awakening at the required time in the morning. And typically what this is going to result in, compounding that sleepiness, is it's going to result in sleep loss, because these individuals cannot, your wake time's usually fixed by school, work, etc., and they cannot fall asleep early enough to get in an adequate amount of sleep before that desired wake time. Symptoms have to be present for 3 months. And when these individuals can sleep at the schedule they want to, they have normal sleep quality and duration, and they'll just be at this later time. And that's a great way to help make this diagnosis. And again, sleep logs are required and actigraphy is recommended. The epidemiology of delayed sleep-wake phase disorder is really unclear in the population overall. Some investigations have cited as low as 0.117. Some have said 1.5%. In adolescents and young adults, it's higher, up to 7%. And if you look at an insomnia population, people complaining of difficulty falling asleep, in a sleep disorder center, it's going to be about 10% of those patients will actually end up meeting criteria for having delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, and there's no known sex differences. Delayed sleep-wake phase disorder is commonly associated with depression. So in one group of 200 patients with delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, half of them had a history of depression. And then in another group, nearly 2/3 of delayed sleep-wake phase patients were in a moderately to severe depressed state. So something to make sure that's evaluated. And this study looked at chronotype, and just to throw out there again, chronotype is your circadian preference. It doesn't mean you have the actual disorder, but in individuals who they characterized their chronotype, they also evaluated the Zung self-rating depression scale. Higher is worse, more than 48 is moderate to severe depression. And you can see as we go from intermediate type, which is you have a normal circadian preference, to more evening type, we have increases in that depression score. Okay, so very, very common to be associated with delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, and even a potential increased risk in evening chronotypes. So we know that the sleep-wake pattern gets much later during adolescence, and this was initially thought to be behavioral. However, there's actual biological changes that underlie the shift in sleep-wake patterns. And the circadian period, that circadian tau, becomes longer in adolescence. So what does that mean? So if we need, an average person needs to shift their clock 0.15 hours earlier every day to maintain alignment with the external 24-hour day between their endogenous circadian phase and that external time. If that circadian tau is longer, it requires a greater amount of daily phase advance to stay aligned with the 24-hour day. So what happens is they become entrained or kind of stuck at a later time. The other thing, in addition to the circadian period or tau becoming longer in adolescence, is there's a reduction in homeostatic sleep drive in adolescence. So they have more difficulty falling asleep from that. And then the light exposure at that time can also propagate this circadian phase delay. Okay, pathophysiology. So we talked about prolonged circadian tau. There's also genetic mutations that have been thought to underlie this, like CRY1, PER3, different HLA types, clock. Individuals with delayed sleep-wake phase disorder may have more sensitivity to the phase delaying effects of light, so they're more vulnerable to light pushing their internal clock later. They could have decreased sensitivity to the phase advancing effects of light and decreased exposure to the phase advancing effects of light as well. They might have an abnormality in their homeostatic regulation of sleep that also contributes to this later shift in sleep time. So this study here with the picture on the top right were individuals, both controls in the clear panel and delayed sleep-wake phase patients in the back. They were sleep deprived for 24 hours, and then they gave them 10-minute nap opportunities across a 24-hour day. And the gray here is they aligned these individuals with their periods of melatonin secretion, okay? So even though they were sleeping at different times, in the graph here, they presented it aligned by their period of melatonin secretion. So during that period of melatonin secretion, there's no difference in the minutes of sleep that controls and delayed sleep-wake phase patients were able to get in that nap. They all slept similarly. But when you look at nap times that were timed outside of the period of melatonin secretion, we can see that the controls slept much longer during those naps in the face of sleep deprivation. So what this suggests is individuals with delayed sleep-wake phase disorder cannot sleep outside of their circadian phase, even if they're sleep deprived. And I hope that answers the question that's plagued people for a long time about, like, well, they're getting up earlier, right? They started school. I know they were sleeping all summer, 2 a.m. to 10 a.m., but they started school. They got up at 6 a.m. They should sleep better tonight. And this is potentially why those individuals don't, and they develop delayed sleep-wake phase disorder. Okay, advanced sleep-wake phase disorder. There's a significant advance or earlier timing of the major sleep episode in relation to what is desired or required. So these individuals have difficulty staying awake until bedtime. They're falling asleep during Wheel of Fortune. Sometimes they have a lot of trouble even during dinner, and then they wake up before desired. And if you let them sleep when they want to sleep, they'll sleep very well. Again, sleep logs, ideally with actigraphy. With advanced sleep-wake phase disorder, we know that people who are depressed can present by awakening earlier than desired. So make sure to evaluate for that. But if somebody is happy and they sleep well when they go to bed early and wake up early, and they have trouble when they try and stay up late, it's likely advanced sleep-wake phase disorder. Unclear population prevalence. And also unclear really to determine for those who seek help, because a lot of people might not seek treatment for advanced sleep-wake phase disorder because our society kind of rewards it, right? Early bird gets the worm. So, and another quote, nothing good ever happens after midnight, which is a common football coach quote. So we don't really know how many of these people there are, and if this is really causing a problem. It probably has to be quite pronounced. So we see this in individuals who are older, but if you have a younger individual that has this presentation of an advanced sleep-wake period, we do need to ask about family history because there is familial advanced sleep-wake phase disorder. And as you can see from the pedigree, this is inherited in an autosomal dominant pattern. And the mutations that might cause this, PER2, less likely PER3, casein kinase 1 delta, CRY2, and timeless. And these individuals, so this is the opposite of delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, they might have a shorter circadian tau. So their sleep-wake timing gets positioned at an earlier time in reference to the 24-hour day. They might have a heightened sensitivity to the phase advancing effects of light and a reduced sensitivity to the phase delaying effects of light. Okay, moving on. Irregular sleep-wake rhythm. These individuals essentially have no circadian rhythm. Their sleep is occurring entirely with the homeostatic sleep drive, so it's scattered throughout the 24-hour day in a irregularly irregular pattern, and they have to have at least 3 periods of sleep during a 24-hour period. This is where it's really, really helpful to have that actigraphy accompanying your sleep logs. Again, the epidemiology of these circadian rhythm disorders is really, really hard to ascertain. This one typically accompanies neurodegenerative disease like dementia. And they think that the reason this happens, although we don't really know, is due to abnormalities in the central clock, because irregular sleep-wake rhythm disorder is often in the presence of neurodevelopmental or neurodegenerative disorders, might be due to reduced access or exposure to light, activity, and social contact as well. Non-24-hour sleep-wake rhythm disorder. There can be insomnia, excessive daytime sleepiness, or both, as well as asymptomatic periods. And this is due to a misalignment between our external day and a non-entrained endogenous circadian rhythm of sleep-wake propensity. So this used to be called free running, and that might have been a better description. So your circadian phase is free running, completely independent of time. And sleep logs, again, actigraphy is super helpful here, and then it might be required for a very prolonged period of time, particularly in blind individuals that have this. So the epidemiology, this is very common in people who are totally blind. If you're totally blind without light perception, almost 2/3. And if you're totally blind but do have some light perception, it might be seen in about 1/3. There's also cited cases of non-24-hour sleep-wake rhythm disorder. This does have a gender predilection. This is most commonly be male, young males with symptom onset in their 20s, oftentimes with a premorbid psychiatric disorder, or if not, 34% of these individuals develop depression. Now, these individuals will often have delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, or at least an evening chronotype, prior to developing non-24-hour sleep-wake rhythm disorder. So in sighted individuals, it's probably a spectrum of similar pathophysiology. So why does this happen? So we oftentimes think of circadian rhythm disorders linearly, right? We'll say like good, early, late, or chopped up and irregular, right? So with non-24-hour sleep-wake rhythm disorder, we should think of this more as an oscillatory disorder. So I had someone make me this picture. The blue sine wave here, or cosine wave, that has a period of 24 hours, and the red one has a period of 25 hours. And what you can see happen is that these over time will shift in and out of phase with one another because they're oscillating at a different period. And what happens with non-24 sleep-wake rhythm disorder is, because this typically occurs with taus that are longer than 24-hour rhythm, longer than 24 hours, not shorter, is that the circadian propensity for sleep in relation to external time is going to drift later and later each day. And the magnitude of that drift is dependent on tau. So if your circadian tau is 25 hours, you can estimate that sleep-wake timing will become an hour later each day. Now, why does this take place? Well, in blind individuals, it makes sense, right? We talked about we need circadian Zeitgebers, particularly light, to keep our 24.2-hour endogenous rhythm aligned to the 24-hour day. So if you do not have availability of that light input to the clock, you will not have that required daily phase advance, and your endogenous circadian phase will just go along on its own, which results in that sleep period timing being later and later each day in reference to external time. But what about individuals who do have access to light? Well, there seems to be a problem with the ability of their endogenous circadian phase to entrain or align to the 24-hour day, producing the non-24-hour phenotype. And that could be because the circadian tau is so long that it's what we call beyond the range of entrainment. So there's no amount of phase advancing light that can align this person to the 24-hour day. So their tau just goes on its own. own and becomes completely misaligned with external time and oscillates independently. But we don't really know. This is very difficult to study. If the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells and the retinal hypothalamic tract are intact, even individuals who have light perception blindness can entrain with light therapy because the circadian light pathways are independent from the vision forming pathways. This is a beautiful case series. If you have time to read it, this is like one of those ones you want to have some popcorn, maybe a glass of wine. I found this so good. This is by the circadian experts at Harvard. And what this is these were individuals who presented with the non-24-hour phenotype. So their sleep-wake timing came later and later each day. And they took these people into the lab, their circadian lab, for a prolonged period of time. And what they found is there was no circadian dysfunction in these individuals. They were able to shift normally to light. So what was found is it was their self-selected sleep and wake times, which gates your self-selected light-dark timing, that shifts the circadian pacemaker, so they appeared to free run. And I've had a lot of patients since the pandemic, I've had to tell this. I'm like, you can make yourself free run. You're doing an N of 1 experiment. And if you're playing video games during the phase delay portion of the PRC to light on a double monitor, you are pushing your clock later, and you can make yourself free run in reference to the 24-hour day. And that is exactly what this is getting. Okay. Just a little quote from the LA Times back in 1966. If you're going to be a member of the jet set and fly off to Kathmandu for coffee with King Mahendra, wrote Perez Sutton, you can count on contracting jet lag, a debility not unakin to a hangover. Jet lag derives from the simple fact that jets travel so fast that they leave your body rhythms behind. And this is honestly, it's from 1966 from a lay publication. It is the best description I have ever heard of jet lag. So we can traverse time zones faster than our internal clocks can adjust. And just because the clock on the wall changes when you get to your location, it doesn't mean your endogenous circadian timing changes. Now, pictures are worth 1,000 words. This is, I always show this picture. So my husband is from Hawaii. And we used to go to Hawaii every single year, and we go for a really long time, like 10 days, 2 weeks. So we'd become like local Hawaii people at that time. We were entrained to Hawaiian time. And then we would fly back and add to East Coast. And as you can see here, my children, I have a lot of modifications going on here. My children are not adhering to my in-flight recommendations. And this one is now 14, and he's still wearing this look on his face, the exact same look. So we would get back to Ann Arbor. They didn't listen to me. And lo and behold, midnight Eastern Standard Time, they were still set to Hawaii time, which was 7:17 p.m. here at 12:17. And that's jet lag. Your timing remains where you originated from after you're entrained to that timing. So the ICSD-3 TR criteria, insomnia or excessive daytime sleepiness, along with sleep loss that's associated with transmeridian, so across time zones, across at least 2 time zones before you can have jet lag. And there has to be some impairment of daytime function, fatigue, somatic symptoms that are typically the GI system, because that GI clock is really strong, taking place within 1 to 2 days after travel. Now, this is distinct from travel fatigue. So when we have travel, we expect that we're going to be flying like this, but we're typically flying like this. So you're cramped, you're dehydrated, you're off your routine, and just that alone can cause fatigue, confusion, and headache. But this is travel fatigue is independent from the number of time zones you cross. So for example, if you go north to south super far, like I flew to Brazil one year, it was an overnight flight, I was a wreck, but I think it's only like 1 time zone difference. That's not jet lag, that's just travel fatigue, and it should resolve after you sleep well for 1 night. Now, with jet lag, it's much easier to travel west than east. Why? Because traveling eastward requires that your endogenous clock phase advances to align with local time at your destination. Westward travel requires that your endogenous clock phase delay to align with local time at your destination. And the reason it's easier to delay than advance, which we need for westward travel, is because most of our circadian taus are longer than 24 hours. So it's easier to push that endogenous phase later when the circadian tau is longer than 24 hours. So this is going to happen naturally without any treatment. So 90 minutes per day in a delay direction, 60 minutes per day in the advanced direction. As you can imagine, the more time zones you cross, the longer it takes to adjust, in roughly 1 day per time zone. And obviously treatment is going to facilitate or speed that up because people don't want to spend their entire vacation jet lagged. And the ASM does recommend that if you're traveling less than 2 days, you stay on home time. Okay, shift work disorder. So insomnia or excessive sleepiness that's accompanied by total reduction of total sleep time in the context of a work schedule that's overlapping with a usual time for sleep. And again, sleep logs and actigraphy. So the most problematic shift schedule for shift work disorder are rotating shifts, counterclockwise, worse than clockwise. Again, because that circadian tau is longer than 24 hours, we're going to do better going in the clockwise direction, which requires a circadian phase delay. It's been recognized as a probable carcinogen by the World Health Organization since 2007 because of increased risk of breast, prostate, and colorectal cancer, as well as other health disorders that are non-cancerous like diabetes, coronary artery disease, depression, obesity. And obviously, with shift work, there's a marked increase in workplace accidents. Okay, so why do we have shift work disorder? So imagine somebody that's sleeping great 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Their dim light melatonin onset is at 9 p.m. Their core body temperature minimum is around 5 a.m. So that time is their high circadian propensity for sleep after that melatonin onset, going through a few hours after that core body temperature minimum. So now they start a night shift job. Just because you're required to be awake at night doesn't mean your endogenous phase is going to instantaneously adjust. So what we can see here, now that dim light melatonin onset of 9, that core body temperature minimum of 5 a.m., and that high propensity for sleep due to melatonin secretion, this now aligns with the work period, okay? So they're going to be very sleepy, particularly at that nadir of circadian alertness around 5 a.m. Then what happens? They go home and they fall asleep easily in the morning, right? Because their homeostatic sleep drive's really high, right? They fall asleep for a few hours, dissipate that homeostatic sleep drive, and then they have difficulty remaining asleep because they don't have that low sleep promoting circadian alerting signal. The circadian alerting signal has gone up. And then this is perpetuated. They don't adjust because on their days off, they go back to a daytime wakefulness, nighttime sleep schedule. And so it's this kind of double whammy of being awake during a nadir of circadian alertness and during your period of melatonin secretion, and then being sleep deprived because from a circadian standpoint, you cannot attain adequate sleep during your allotted sleep periods. Now, that's theoretical, right? So is this actually true? So this was studied. I think this was in Canada, but this is a clock here. So we have 5 p.m. to 7 a.m., then to 5 p.m. the next day. And these curves here are melatonin secretion. So this is your melatonin levels. Now, the blue line, this is happy night workers. So what do we see? Their melatonin is low at night and high during the day. So their high levels of melatonin, low circadian alerting signal, are aligned with that daytime allotted sleep period. And then during the nighttime, melatonin is low, which reflects a high circadian alerting signal, so wake promoting. If you look at the brown curve, these are individuals with shift work disorder. And what we can see is they have not adapted from a circadian standpoint. Their melatonin secretion is very high in the middle of the night, and it's low during the daytime period, which is allotted for sleep. Shift work epidemiology. So about a third of shift workers actually have shift work disorder. Not everyone gets it. Shift work disorders, even without shift work disorders, have up to an hour less of total sleep time than day workers. And if you look at those with actual shift work disorder, they're going to be about 90 minutes less. And then you can see shift work. 2/3 of shift workers, even without shift work disorder, are complaining of EDS. 19% of shift workers have clinically significant insomnia. So it's probably a diagnosis of shift work disorder. Jet lag epidemiology, we didn't talk about that. It's very hard. It's a transient problem, so it's difficult to know the prevalence. But when they survey international business travelers, a lot of them report that jet lag was fairly present or always present. And when you get older, you're actually less impacted, which is probably because your circadian rhythmicity, your amplitude isn't as high in general, so it's not as dramatic when you have a misalignment. Okay, so I do have questions for the treatment of these disorders. It says intrinsic, but this is treatment of all the disorders. I'm going to circulate these to you guys so you can do them on your own, and I can get to the summary and answer some questions. But these are great ways to test yourself, and I've provided you with the correct answers as well as explanations. But just some high yield pointers, so especially for the boards, but also helpful for clinic. So your ICSD-TR diagnostic criteria for the intrinsic disorders, I put these here. So delay obviously is going to be later sleep-wake timing, insomnia at sleep onset, difficulty awakening in the morning, and they sleep fine when they're sleeping at the biologically preferred time. So that's also present for advanced, which is the direct opposite of this. And then again, we have sleep log is required for this, and actigraphy whenever possible. Irregular sleep-wake rhythm disorder, you really need to remember that 3 bouts in a 24-hour period without a major sleep bout. And clinically, this presents with people who have, they're walking around at night and they're dozing off throughout the day. That's typically what you see, but there's really no circadian rhythm at all to sleep. Non-24-hour, again, it's dependent on the beat cycle, where you are with your endogenous circadian phase, as opposed to what time it is externally and when those align. So you can have both insomnia and excessive daytime sleepiness, as well as periods where these individuals feel good. And it's recommended here, again, sleep log and actigraphy, but at least 14 days so you can catch that pattern of free running. For shift work and jet lag, sleep logs, and actigraphy are not required due to this transient disorder. And again, with both of these, remember insomnia and/or excessive daytime sleepiness, both associated with reduced total sleep time. The difference is shift work disorder, obviously associated with when your work schedule overlaps with the usual sleep time, whereas jet lag requires at least 2 time zones be traversed. Know your estimated phase relationship to sleep. This is you can figure out almost any circadian problem in clinic or on the boards if you know this. So dim light melatonin onset is always 2 hours before natural sleep onset. So individual who falls asleep at 2 a.m., you're going to estimate their DILMO at midnight. Core body temperature minimum is 2 to 3 hours before habitual sleep offset. So somebody that on their days off or during the summer sleeps well until 10 a.m., that's when they naturally wake up, their core body temperature minimum would be around 7 to 8 a.m. And phase shifting is dependent not on clock time, but on this biological time that you're going to give people these Zeitgeber interventions. So light prior to the core body temperature minimum, that's going to make the circadian phase delay or later in reference to the 24-hour day. Light after the core body temperature minimum is going to produce a phase advance, move your internal clock earlier in reference to a 24-hour day. The magnitude of circadian phase delay when light is given in the delay portion of the PRC is greatest after your body's own melatonin secretion has begun. The magnitude advance is greatest right before and a few hours after your natural rise time. Okay, so that's how you remember and enact light for treatment of these different disorders. Phase response curve to melatonin. Melatonin produces a phase advance when it's given a few hours prior to your body's own dim light melatonin onset. Melatonin produces a phase delay when it's given after your body's own dim light melatonin onset. The magnitude of phase shift produced by melatonin is greatest when you're going about 3 to 4, 5 hours even prior to dim light melatonin onset. The magnitude of phase delay is going to be greatest kind of during the biological day when there's no melatonin secretion. Treatment guidelines by the ASM, these also have to be known, and you can test yourself on these with the cases. Advanced sleep-wake phase disorder, only evening light is recommended, even though you could feasibly time melatonin appropriately to produce a phase delay that might result in next day melatonin high levels and result in sedation. Delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, adults and children and adolescents, so all age groups, is recommended to give them strategically timed melatonin. For children and adolescents only, post-awakening light and behavioral treatment. That does not mean light will not help your adults. It's just that there wasn't enough data for a strong recommendation in the 2015 guidelines. Non-24-hour sleep-wake disorder, there's only a recommendation for blind individuals, and that's strategically timed melatonin. For irregular sleep-wake rhythm disorders in elderly with dementia, yes to treatment with daytime light, no to melatonin, even combined with light, and that was because melatonin in these individuals shows reduced function without providing much benefit. No hypnotics in this group, obviously. However, if you're looking at kids with neurodevelopmental disorders and irregular sleep-wake rhythm disorders, strategically timed melatonin is recommended for them. Approach to jet lag questions. When you're looking at less than 8 time zones traveled, the rule of thumb is if you are traveling eastward, your body requires a phase advance to align with your new local time. If you're traveling westward, your endogenous circadian phase must delay to align with your new destination time. However, if you're traveling 8 or more time zones, you're always going to want treatment that promotes a phase delay to take place. And the reason is because when you're traveling with that degree of magnitude, the light is ample during times when your body isn't expecting it and it shifts the wrong way, something called antidromic shifting. So greater 8 or more time zones, always try and promote a phase delay to align with the new time. Make sure you read jet lag questions very carefully. So are they asking what you should do before departure, after arrival, upon return? Remember, circadian phase is set to your originating location. Don't base your decisions on timing of melatonin and light as if the person has already moved their clock into the new time zone, right? The clock is set at the originating time zone, and draw it out. This will help you. Shift work questions, what's the question asking? So for example, even though hypnotics and melatonin have been shown to improve daytime sleep, the results on alertness during the night shift are mixed. And keep in mind, the only FDA-approved treatments for sleepiness and shift work disorder are modafinil and armodafinil. Here are your resources. So obviously the ICSD-3 TR. I'm the Circadian Rhythm section editor for Up to Date. So this is really expanded and is a great quick resource. And then the practice parameter for the intrinsic disorders was done in 2015. The extrinsic disorders, the last one we have is from 2007, and they've been working on redoing that, but I don't think it's not published yet. And this is a nice circadian review here in the Lancet from 2022. And again, I'm sorry I had so much. I think you're going to find the cases are really, really helpful. And so I will send those around as a PDF for you guys to do on your own. And oh, okay. I was like, what's in the chat?
Oh, I was
the next one.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Goldstein, for this comprehensive review. I am sure it helped a lot of us taking care of patients in clinic, as well as those who are going to be taking the boards or doing their recertifications. So I would like to announce that these Dr. Goldstein's talk will be posted in the ATS SRN website on September 16th, so look out for that. And then our next webinar / journal club will be on October, and it will be on the Surmount OSA trial. Thank you very much, everybody. This is a great attendance. Thank you.